here on 365 Sports. Steve Berkowitz, USA Today Sports, does an amazing job with a lot of financials, and not just that, but covering the college football landscape. On a story today, NIL bill expected in-house would provide legal help sought by the NCAA. And Steve now joins us on 365 Sports. Steve, thanks for your time. Love what you put up on your Twitter feed and also with what you do with USA Today. So we've heard this. Dr. Livingstone at Baylor, of course, has been very much involved. The new Baker, the new president. How much of this is truly, in your opinion, going to have a chance to get inside and not just discussed but possibly passed?
Well, first of all, I want to say thanks for having me on, and I hope I don't disappoint here standing in. This is Mac Rhodes' usual time.
He's normally in about 20 minutes. No, you're good. You're good. You didn't push him back. No, we're good.
Okay. All right, because I know people are always going to be interested to hear from him, and I appreciate the kind words. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see whether any of this stuff moves in Congress or not. I mean, there have been, in the past few years, there have been a couple of these bills, at least every year. Most of them have gone, all of them have really gone nowhere. I mean, they've been referred to committees and then not gotten anywhere. Obviously, things are a little different now with the way things have gone with NIL and with the lobbying effort that the NCAA has undertaken, particularly since Charlie Baker became the president. He was hired in part because of the perception of his political acumen and political connections. So, I think there's a greater chance than there's ever been of there being congressional action. It's just going to be a question of what direction this goes. I'm not convinced that the bill that I wrote about this morning is going to be the only one put together. Senator Tuberville and Senator Manchin have been talking about putting together a bill. And so, whether or not this would come out of the House of Representatives, come out of the Senate, and where those things meet, all remains to be seen. But there does seem to be, some level of urgency around this, and it's just going to be interesting to see where it goes.
Steve, I would think that a big stumbling block, especially considering that, there's no supermajority on either side of this thing, is that there are not additions or plans to add athlete insurance for the and all of those things to the bill, which Democrats would really want. Is that what you think will stall this up if it would get out of committee? Yeah, I mean, it's right. I mean, that's exactly right. The differences in this have been largely along party lines. Democrats, both in the House and in the Senate, have been very keenly interested in expanding health benefits, educational benefits. They've expressed interest in stuff having to do with trying to close loopholes in Title IX that have become apparent over the past, that have been well known, but got pretty well documented during the 50th anniversary year. Richard Blumenthal, a senator from Connecticut, has talked about trying to figure out how to deal with NIL for athletes who are foreigners, because under student visa rules, it makes it very difficult for those folks to be able to take advantage of name, image, and likeness stuff here in the United States. So you have a lot of different interests at work here, and by and large, Democrats have been very, very loath to look at the idea of granting the NCAA any kind of antitrust protection, which is something that the NCAA very much wants, and that Republicans have seemed to be more willing to potentially provide to them through this kind of legislation. So you've got a lot of competing interests, and again, it's hard to know how this all comes out. I mean, obviously, it's no secret that Congress is having trouble dealing with getting through legislation, and things like a budget and the and the debt limit and everything else. And those are really, really fundamental issues to the country. Makes sort of college sports look like a much, much smaller thing. So,
Steve, can you also touch on the bill out in California and what that means in regards to this and what complications maybe that has as well, just in terms of what it's aiming for versus what this is aiming for and further conflicts of interest?
Sure. The short answer in terms of how these two things interact is that if Congress were to pass a bill, it would override state action, and they would, certainly they would include language to that effect in the bill. In the meantime, what's going on in California is that there is a bill that is now going to be set for a vote within possibly this week, but certainly by the end of next week. The California Assembly, their House of Representatives, will vote on a bill that would create the opportunity for revenue sharing for the athletes. It would be based on the revenues generated by a particular team and athletics program, and it would result in payments to players. It starts to get very complicated after that basic construct, but it also sets up a very elaborate regulatory arrangement, because the schools will be required to do a whole bunch of other things in addition to creating this revenue sharing opportunity with the athletes. And that's also a very complicated piece of it. And again, that's one of the things that you would run into in Congress as well at the federal level, is who oversees all of this. If you want to sort of standardize how NIL works, is the NCAA going to oversee it? Is a third-party agency going to oversee it? Is the Federal Trade Commission going to oversee it? And again, that's another sort of complicating factor here. And that's also part of what's going on in California. I think the general consensus is that the Assembly in California will approve this. The author of the bill is the Assembly Appropriations Chair. He's a former San Diego State basketball player, and he, seems pretty intent upon getting this through. Whether or not it will pass the California Senate still remains to be seen, and I think you'll see much more intensive lobbying by the schools out there and potentially by the NCAA to keep that from happening.
How much of all of what Baker and others are trying to do is to grab back the hay that left the barn when they had all these controls, and that they want to maybe limit any kind of athletes' rights movement, whatever? They can't get it back in the barn, can they?
It's going to be very difficult for them to do that. And I'm not even sure, and I've asked lawyers about this, and I have not been able to get an entirely clear answer. The other sort of hay that's out of the barn are these antitrust lawsuits that have already been filed. So even if you give the NCAA legal protection, I don't know whether or not the association will continue to have exposure to the ongoing lawsuits. There are 2 antitrust cases in California that are pending, one of which potentially, if the judge certifies it as a class action, would stand to subject the NCAA and the major conferences to billions of dollars in damages. And you have another case in Pennsylvania that also has the prospect of creating an employment arrangement or requiring payment of athletes at least a minimum wage under the Fair Labor Standards Act. So I don't know whether or not a federal law that's passed now can shield the NCAA from actions that are already underway. So yeah, there are a lot of things going on in terms of trying to reel stuff back in. And how do you, again, yes, you're trying to regulate this a little bit, but yeah, you're trying to figure out a way to try to bring, at least from the NCAA's perspective and the school's perspective, to try to bring some order to something that has, gotten out to a point where there's just virtually no enforcement of rules about what's going on here.
Wouldn't they almost have to write or amend the bill to protect themselves from losing those antitrust cases in some sort of way? Because they're not they're not the 27 Yankees when it comes to going to court, Steve. I mean, they're not good at that right now. They keep losing, and I don't know if that's going to turn around for them.
Right. I agree. I mean, the NCAA, has had a very tough time. The judge who handled the O'Bannon
and Alston cases at the district court level is to say they're in front of the same judge for these other two cases as they stand in the district court. The NCAA did not fare terribly well in an appeals hearing, oral argument that occurred in the case in Pennsylvania. And so, yeah, I mean, they're facing some uphill battles potentially legally. But again, I just don't know the extent to which congressional action can bail out, can short circuit what's already in place. I think for sure they can prevent legal action going forward, but I don't know how this would work currently. So yeah, I mean, you would still potentially have that problem.
There was note, I guess, in the last week about Larry Scott still getting some money. And now we know that Warren is gone and left a little bit there for Tony Petitti to deal with. But Bob Bowlesby, of course, has been out for basically less than a year. I saw your note about NCAA Power 5 conferences or cash cows. How much money is being paid to commissioners of the Autonomy 5 conferences that are not even a part of it anymore? The folks, the commissioners who are currently the commissioners of the autonomy conferences, basically now the going rate for those folks is in the low 3 millions. Greg Sankey is making, I think, about 3.6 at this point. It's a little bit hard to gauge because you have guys who are coming in new, but that seems to be the going rate, somewhere in $3.5 million range. What's going on with some of the commissioners who left is that in some instances, like in Jim Delaney's case, Delaney had negotiated and been awarded in his contract a bonus that was tied to the Big Ten's previous the television package that he helped negotiate. So Jim Delaney will be paid bonus money on a deferred basis going forward through the year 2027. And that's a pre-negotiated thing that was in place when he retired. So he will continue to be paid for 5 more years. 4 more years. I get a little confused with the way the 990s are structured. Larry Scott, his severance arrangement with the Pac-12, he'll be paid for he was being paid in 2022. His contract originally was supposed to go through June of 2022. He cut it short by a year. So they owed him money contractually for 1 more year. I don't know the status with Bob Bowlesby or Kevin Warren because of the way they departed, whether or not they have deferred payments that they're due or not. The story that Pete Thamel did on ESPN that you were referring to concerning the television stuff that Tony Petitti has been trying to nail down, which is a really fine piece of work by Pete, talked about there being some question as to whether or not Kevin Warren will be getting any kind of a bonus similar to Delaney's bonus that was tied to the TV payments. And based on Pete's reporting, he said that that's still an unknown. So you definitely have folks who worked as commissioners of these leagues who have money that's still owed to them, which, by the way, is not entirely dissimilar from the way this works in other nonprofit organizations. You have college presidents who have similar deferred pay plans. When Charlie Weiss got fired by Notre Dame paid him out over 7 years. So when folks get fired, that works in different ways. When Gary Patterson's deal with TCU, when the numbers about that showed up on Texas Christian's tax records this year, the university said that they paid it all out in one lump, and that was the end of it. That Gary Patterson is not continuing to get paid by the school, but they paid him. It was a low 8-figure amount. All right, Steve, we appreciate your time. Great stuff. Someone wins a bowl game, there's a bonus. Somebody wins a certain amount of games or gets to a championship game, a conference championship game, a tournament. You fire it up there on your timeline. It's a really good follow. Steve Berkowitz, USA Today. Steve, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Yep, absolutely. Need to get you on more often than we do. That's Steve Berkowitz. We appreciate his time. Again, Mac Rhodes.